In addition to carbohydrate metabolism and lipid metabolism, there's a third major type of metabolism that goes on in plants, and that is nitrogen metabolism. We talked earlier in the semester about the essential nutrient nitrogen and some specific physiological roles for it, which there are many, but by far the majority of nitrogen that plants uptake is incorporated into the form of amino acids. Amino acids are used to make proteins. In fact, they're commonly referred to as the building blocks of proteins. Well, what do plants use proteins for? Well, proteins are what all of the enzymes we've been talking about when we've gone through photosynthesis and respiration, for example, rubisco and pep carboxylase, all the other enzymes and all the little machinery that you find inside of these organelles like ATP synthases and NADPH reductases. These are all made out of proteins. Proteins predominantly used in plants to make enzymes. So we'll say make up enzymes. So, what kind of processes require enzymes? Virtually all of them do, besides just plain old osmosis. And so, plants need lots and lots of nitrogen for this very reason. Nitrogen, if you recall, is the nutrient that we most often apply into the form of a fertilizer because plants simply need so much of it. So, most plants have to absorb it from the soil, and they absorb it in the form usually of nitrate, and in some cases they'll also absorb it in the form of ammonium, which looks like that. They're both ions. They have ionic charges on them, and they're reliant on finding nitrate or ammonium floating around in the soil solution, which just means the water that is in the soil. And where does it come from? Well, it can come from the breakdown of old plant parts and animal wastes and decaying organic matter of various types will produce some of it. Unfortunately, there's a very abundant source of nitrogen all around us that plants, or most plants I should say, can't get at, and that is in the form of plain old nitrogen gas. The air that we're all breathing at this very moment is made up of nearly 80% nitrogen gas, but most plants, like I said, can't get at this nitrogen or can't make use of that nitrogen, and so they're reliant on these two forms of nitrogen. And so when we want to grow plants to certain ends, or in other words, we want to grow plants to either produce crops with, or in the case of landscaping, for aesthetic value, we typically want them to grow at the peak of their capabilities or at the peak growth rates, so they produce higher yields or so that they look nice and green and vigorous. And so that usually requires more nitrogen than the plants can naturally get from the soil, and so we apply fertilizer. But there's one group of plants that has done something about that, and those are the legumes. And the legumes basically refer to what we would more commonly call beans, or the bean family. Many of the species that you find in the bean family have figured out a way to make use of nitrogen gas that's in the atmosphere. And they do this by forming a symbiotic relationship with certain types of bacteria called rhizobium bacteria. This is in your notes. That are commonly found in our soils. Symbiotic means it's a win-win situation for both organisms involved, and so we'll talk about who wins what and what benefit lies in this relationship for each of them. Well, rhizobium bacteria grow inside of the roots of many of these species of legumes. Okay, and so we'll say they grow inside the roots of the plant, and they form little colonies inside of these roots that we refer to as root nodules, because the root swells up in these regions. And let's take a look at a root nodule. This is a cross section of a root nodule, and this portion out here would be the actual nodule. You can see, if we look closely here, we can see in this region the xylem and the phloem in the interior of the normally sized root. But all along these plants, if they have colonies of these bacteria, they'll form little spherical swellings all along their roots. And inside of them we see this, and these have been stained to show the bacteria colony inside. This whole red region here are these bacteria, and these rhizobium bacteria are naturally reddish or pink in color, and if you cut open one without a microscope, you would usually be able to see a pinkish tint to the tissue inside of this root nodule. So what do? Well, these rhizobium bacteria have the ability to use nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and turn it into a plant usable form, nitrate. So the bacteria turn N2 into nitrate. Okay. And so they basically provide nitrate to the plant. Okay. They're feeding nitrate to the plant's root system. In return, the bacteria is provided with sugars, and they're provided with moisture and basically a sterile, nice environment inside of this root system so that they can grow. So it's a win-win situation. Legumes as crops are very valuable in the fact that they tend to need much, much less nitrogen fertilizer input because of these rhizobium bacteria that they let set up shop inside their roots. So, for example, beans or peas or soybeans, for example, would take less nitrogen to grow than, say, a comparative crop such as corn. We would have to fertilize a corn crop with much more nitrogen type fertilizers than a soybean crop.